Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're just letting people filter in, and once we've got a few more, I will start this webinar. Okay, let's give it a minute or so, and then we can start, I think. Okay, let's kick off. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the latest CER webinar. I'm Ian Bond, I'm the Foreign Policy Director at the CER, and I'm delighted that we are launching this excellent policy brief today on strategic autonomy and transatlantic relations by Sophia Besch and Luigi Scazzieri. And I'd also like to give a special welcome to Claudia Major, the head of the International Security Research Division of the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik in Berlin, who will be commenting on the policy brief once Sophia and Luigi have summarized their findings. I should start by saying that we're very grateful to the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for their support for this project and for their previous work with the CER. We haven't yet had the chance to meet in person the relatively new director for the UK and Ireland, Matthias Barner, and so I'd like to give him a virtual welcome to the CER and say that we look forward to meeting him again virtually soon and meeting him in person in a few months' time when hopefully the pandemic will be in the rearview mirror. I've been trying to work out today whether this event is very well timed or very badly timed, coming as it does the day after Joe Biden's inauguration. The original impetus for the project came from Donald Trump's ambivalent attitude to European security. It was that more than anything else that made the EU start to take more seriously the internal debate on its role in defense that had been dribbling on inconsequentially since the 1990s. So it was against the background of Trump's questioning of the US's obligations in NATO in particular that we held two workshops in 2019 and 2020 that fed into this policy brief. Now, we have Joe Biden in the White House. We have a much more Europe-friendly set of senior officials taking over, and there will be a strong temptation, I feel, for European leaders to revert to how things were before 2016, to trust the US to take the lion's share of the burden of defending Europe, while Europeans do the absolute minimum that they can get away with. Sophia and Luigi's paper argues, and I'd agree, that to do that would be a big mistake. But I hope that what we'll get more of a sense of this afternoon is whether, and if so, how Europe can do more for itself without weakening the transatlantic link, and whether the US can accommodate more EU activity in the defense field without feeling that it is being squeezed out of its role in relation to European security. So I'm hoping that Sophia and Luigi and Claudia will be able to answer some of those questions, and I will hand over to Sophia to get us started.
Ian, and thank you also, Claudia, for joining us today. So I'll start with a little introduction, and then Luigi and I will pass the mic around to sort of present our paper briefly. We wrote this paper as the debate on strategic autonomy was already well underway. And I would say that a main motivation of ours was to provide arguments against three main tenets of the strategic autonomy discussion that sort of kept coming up. First, the notion that the EU has to choose between a transatlantic path and a European one, that European nations have to choose. We think this debate is essentially a distraction. Instead, Europe needs to become a more capable defense actor, both to work better with the United States and because at times it will have to go it alone. Second, we believe that in the post-Trump era, we will not necessarily see this return to the transatlantic bargain of the past, or at least the transatlantic bargain as some may nostalgically remember it, with the US as a protective older relative, occasionally scolding its allies, but fundamentally attached to them and willing to watch over them, and Europeans looking up to and willing to follow the US's course. Instead, a new bargain will have to be reached. And third, we believe that actions speak louder than words, and so we broadly disagree with the notion that with the EU's defense initiatives, member states are actually pursuing autonomy from the United States. We're going to elaborate on a couple of these points in the presentation, but first, I'm sure that many will be very familiar with the strategic autonomy discussion. At this point, let me just give you a really brief outline of the idea of EU strategic autonomy and security and defense, and not in the field of economics, in the field of trade, which is a different game altogether. Let me just put this disclaimer out there in the beginning. The EU has sought to develop a bigger role in defense since the late 1990s, but we have seen a wave of action in the years following 2016. And those efforts, as Ian has said, were spurred in part by US unreliability. They were partly, I think, aided by the political window of opportunity provided by Brexit, but they were also ultimately motivated by threats in the European neighborhood with the crisis in Ukraine and conflict in the Middle East. In November 2016, member states agreed on three high-level priorities for the EU's defense: preventing and managing crises in its neighborhood, building up partners' capabilities, and protecting the EU and European citizens. And I think that the EU's achievements since then can broadly be split in three strands. So we've had defense industrial efforts. Under that, you can surmise the European Defense Fund, CARD, the Coordinated Annual Review on Defense, the new DG on the defense industry in the Commission, and also one pillar of PESCO, the Permanent Structured Cooperation that focus on capability development. Second strand, we've had operational efforts and efforts to improve joint decision making. And under that, I think we can count the MPCC, so the Military Planning and Conduct Capability, the EU's permanent operational headquarters. The other pillar of PESCO, which focuses more on operational improvements, and the discussion around qualified majority voting in common foreign and security policy. And third, I think we've seen efforts to create a common strategic culture through a joint threat analysis and joint decision-making. And notably here is the French initiative, the European Intervention Initiative, and the Strategic Compass, which is currently underway, just started under the German EU presidency. Member states have also raised their defense budgets. In 2019, military expenditure in Central Europe was 61% higher than in 2010. Germany also spent 15% more than in 2010, but of course, not yet the 2%. So these EU efforts to become more capable, I think, have been subsumed under the label of strategic autonomy. But in effect, what we have here are mechanisms and tools and procedures. What is missing still is sort of the common objective and the political and financial investment in EU defense. And I'll go into this a little bit later in the presentation, but suffice to say here that this investment can only come from member states and not from the institutions. But member states remain divided about what the objective should be for EU defense. Many are not willing to make the trade-off between greater defense industrial autonomy and more developed capabilities, because of course, if Europeans want to be less reliant on US firms and strengthen their own defense base, they will find it harder to build up their capabilities to intervene swiftly, decisively. And if Europeans emphasize access to capabilities at the expense of autonomy, they may find that they end up buying more high-end equipment from US firms and their own defense base will atrophy. And so many have seen strategic autonomy as a divisive concept, and they've been wary of annoying the US, frankly. The US has always been ambiguous towards European defense. On the one hand, Washington has always urged Europeans to spend more, to do more. On the other hand, it has been cautious of EU defense cooperation duplicating NATO's efforts. The Trump administration has downright opposed many of the EU defense cooperation initiatives for two main reasons. One, that I think a broad concern that strategic autonomy was a distraction, that it would distract from the 2% goal and undermine NATO. And then a concern that Europeans would no longer buy US equipment. And there were some in Washington who thought that PESCO and the European Defense Fund might lead to the European defense market becoming less open to US companies. And I'd say that Europeans have broadly failed in their efforts to convince Washington that strategic autonomy would mean a more capable Europe, better equipped to shoulder the burden of European security together with the US. And this failure, combined with some Europeans' unwillingness to meet, for example, NATO's 2% target, means that strategic autonomy in effect has remained a source of both transatlantic disagreement and intra-European disagreement. So that's a short version of the story up until now. And then the question that we posed ourselves when writing this policy brief was, well, will the EU and the US go from here under President Biden? And I'll hand over to Luigi for this part.
Well, thank you very much, Sophia. So, yeah, my task is to kind of bring up the story into what Biden's presidency means for the EU's efforts to become a more capable actor. Well, on one hand, I think we can all agree that transatlantic relations are already feeling substantially less tense today than they were a week ago. Of course, the fact that the US president is no longer questioning America's commitment to NATO is going to strengthen the alliance, and Biden's commitment to arms control will also benefit European security. For example, Biden has already stated he intends to rejoin the Iran nuclear deal, assuming that Iran, of course, resumes compliance. All this will make conflict in the Middle East less likely, boosting European security. And debates over transatlantic burden sharing are going to become more civil, although, of course, they won't disappear. But broadly, I think Europeans can react to Biden's presidency in two ways. Ian and Sophia have already touched on them. So it's possible, on one hand, this would be the positive story, that with less fear of alienating Washington, Europeans can actually discuss efforts to strengthen their own security more constructively, with less fear of actually annoying the US. But it is also, of course, possible that with Biden in the White House, all urgency will disappear, Europeans will feel a bit safer, and they won't invest in improving their ability to act. And this, we argue, would be a mistake for essentially two sets of reasons. The first one is that Biden won't change the shift in emphasis of US foreign policy away from Europe and towards the Asia Pacific, which began already under Obama and then continued with Trump. And for example, this means that Biden has committed to reducing the US presence in the Middle East. Now, the reason behind the shift is that there's a bipartisan concern about China in the United States. Democrats don't talk about China in the same crude terms as Trump did, but they still perceive its rise as a threat. And I think it was noteworthy that just a few days ago, when nominee for Secretary of State Antony Blinken was undergoing his confirmation hearing, he actually said that he agreed with Mike Pompeo's characterization of China's repression of the Uyghurs in the Xinjiang as a genocide. So the US will be increasingly focused on countering China and deterring Beijing from asserting itself in its neighborhood. And Europeans are less likely to be able to count on the US to do what it's done so far, namely take the lead in tackling conflicts in their own neighborhood. So of course, Washington will continue to provide deterrence against Russia under Biden, but it is less likely to take the lead in solving conflicts in Europe's near abroad. The one to Libya comes to my mind, at least. The US is going to have a lighter footprint, in particular in the Middle East. supporting local forces, perhaps, and using drones and special forces, but not willing to become involved, at least at such a high intensity as was the case in what now seems like quite a distant past. And the second broad reason why it would be a mistake for Europeans not to take their defense more seriously would be that they can't be sure there won't be another Trump that might then call into question the US's commitment to NATO and the security guarantees the US provides against Russia. And I found the CFR survey that came out just yesterday, I believe, very interesting in this, from this point of view, in the sense that it highlighted how 60% of Europeans thought that the US political system was broken, and 2/3 thought that Europe cannot count on the US for security. So I think all this means that Europeans will need to take on more responsibility for their own security in what in the paper we call a new transatlantic balance. They'll need the right capabilities as well as a more common foreign policy outlook, which is often, quite aside from the lack of capabilities, the reason why joint action proves impossible. If they manage to significantly boost their capabilities and develop a more common foreign policy outlook, then they would be able to handle crisis in Europe's neighborhood with relatively limited US support, and the US would be free to shift its focus towards the Asia Pacific. We thought that an important element in such a new transatlantic balance would be a broader understanding of burden sharing beyond the narrow 2% of GDP on defense metric, because the real issue is not actually money, but the capabilities that money buys, and the broader contribution, which is not only military, but of course also relates to stabilization and countering non-military threats, which the EU is particularly suited at doing. So moving on to how this new balance can be achieved, we have 3 sets of recommendations. The first one regarding the EU, we then have more recommendations for the US. But the first recommendation for the EU is that Europe should focus on concrete outcomes, that Europeans should avoid getting bogged down with unhelpful rhetoric, starting with references to setting up a European army, something that many of its proponents don't actually want, and to try to go beyond the debate on European strategic autonomy in European security and defense, because not only has it been divisive, but I think it also risks distracting from the fact that, broadly speaking, European states agree that they need to be more capable. This, we thought, meant that those Europeans that are proponents of strategic autonomy should shift the emphasis to a more concrete debate about the threats that Europe faces and the capabilities they need to prioritize developing in order to counter these threats. So this goes back to what Sophia said about the strategic compass hopefully being a way. And a greater focus on delivering concrete results would help persuade the US of merits of a stronger Europe. And we thought that a starting point in this regard would be to invest more seriously in aligning NATO's defense planning process with the EU's new coordinated annual review, making sure that the two are joined to the greatest possible degree. And here I'll hand over to Sophia.
Another recommendation to get a bit more concrete, in the knowledge that the EU will not be anytime soon the new bedrock of European defense efforts, EU member states should still try to ensure that EU defense initiatives deliver. 3 things here: money, prioritization, willingness to act. Money first, the economic shock of the pandemic means that national defense spending may well fall in many member states. After the last financial crisis, European governments have cut defense budgets and have reduced spending, especially on research and capability development. And they've prioritized national spending over European security of supply. And these cuts, as we all know, had lasting effects across the EU. The budgets have only very slowly recovered. The capability gaps remain. If they had sufficient resources, then PESCO, the EDF card, could contribute to preventing a similar dynamic today. They could help safeguard European capabilities, technologies, skills, but the funding for these initiatives has been reduced substantially compared to the European Commission's original proposals. And the outlook for national defense research and technology spending also continues to be bleak. By not allocating enough money, member states are effectively setting these initiatives up to underperform. I don't really know how to put a positive spin on this other than there's a next European budget after this one, and perhaps there'll be more money in there. Second, to ensure the success of EU defense initiatives, member states will have to give them a greater sense of direction and prioritize. So a recent EU-led defense review has identified 6 areas as priorities for the joint development of new capabilities: battle tanks, individual protection and awareness systems, patrol ships, countering aerial threats, military mobility, and space-based assets. Now, even if implemented, I don't think that these would necessarily be a game changer, but at least if member states agree to prioritize them, then the EU can add some value to what NATO is already doing, to what bilateral, unilateral defense capability projects are already providing, and to what member states are already doing at the national level. In general, I think it will be difficult for the EU to break into the field of defense planning because member states prefer pursuing big capability projects in small intergovernmental groupings. Plus, the national defense spending plans for the next 5 years have been decided, often in close coordination with NATO, and the EU can only really hope to influence capability planning after 2025. Beyond investing in conventional defense capabilities, the EU should also spur Europeans on to invest more into emerging civilian technologies with military applications, not least to assure that their military forces remain interoperable with the US military. And then finally, Europeans, and this is an area where we have actually seen quite a bit of effort, will have to increase their preparedness to counter hybrid challenges such as disinformation campaigns, particularly from Russia and China. The strategic compass can provide guidance here. The EU should really work closely with NATO, I think, to align this process of writing the compass with the process of writing NATO's new strategic concept, which I hope Claudia will maybe say a few words on. Otherwise, I think the risk is that the compass will become another well-meaning reframing of European defense ambitions, with member states agreeing to do more on paper, but failing to take action in the end. And then third, readiness, willingness to act. Improved capabilities will not make Europe a more effective security actor by themselves. I think that's something that we've lost sight of a little bit in recent years. If they actually plan to deploy troops together, then Europeans will have to continue to focus on developing a common strategic culture and streamlining their decision-making procedures. They will have to invest more in the readiness of their armed forces and in the ability to move these forces. And in addition, I think to activating the operational side of PESCO, where member states have actually pledged to improve their military's ability to deploy together and to reform the way that joint military operations are funded. Member states should also activate treaty provisions that permit the Council to task a group of member states with implementing a military operation on the EU's behalf, rather than asking the whole group of 27 for unanimity. Again, many of these operational efforts will happen through NATO, and that's why NATO-EU cooperation becomes even more important as we go on. I'll hand over for the final bit to Luigi.
Yeah, thank you, Sophia. So just turning to the recommendations that we had to the United States, in essence, I think there's a choice for the US between having allies that are weak and highly dependent on it, or allies that are more independent but far more able to stand on their own feet. And in order to actually have capable allies, you need cooperation at the European level, especially in the industrial field, because the EU is the institution that has the tools to unlock more industrial cooperation, or at least it can contribute greatly to that. So, of course, a more developed European role in defense might mean a degree of European divergence from the US, especially on industrial matters, and maybe less purchases of American weapons. But we didn't think that that Washington should privilege its short-term industrial interests over its longer-term interest in a stronger Europe. And of course, member states can use the capabilities that they generate through European defense initiatives in any framework, not only the EU, of course, but also NATO, the UN, and ad hoc operations as well. So the US should welcome and steer the EU's cooperation initiatives towards collaborative projects that actually lead to added value in areas where NATO has identified shortfalls, but also in areas where the EU is able to add the most value. And these might be areas such as cyber defense, but particularly military mobility. And the US should also ensure, we thought, that any products of European cooperation are aligned with NATO standards and interoperable with the alliance's equipment. So just to wrap up very quickly and take a step back, the debate on strategic autonomy has gone on for a very long time. It's been used as a political football. It's contributed relatively little. It's distracted us from the fact that Europeans agree on the need to be more capable. So Europeans should focus on practical steps to improve their capabilities and on strengthening a common foreign policy outlook. Many of these efforts, as has been said, will take place at the national level through higher defense spending in small groups, but more and more should take place at the European level, which is, if member states are prepared to exploit it, one that can add real value, I think, to capability developments. And I'll finish there.
Great, thank you very much, Luigi. Thank you very much, Sophia. Well, there's a lot there to get one's teeth into. Claudia, I'd be fascinated to hear particularly from a German point of view, how does all of this look? You know, as Sophia, I think, underlined, quite a number of allies have not made their 2%, including Germany. All the kinds of things that Luigi and Sophia have been talking about involve some kind of investment, either at the national level or the EU level. And I just wonder, you know, is the political climate changing to the extent that Germany could begin to contemplate, you know, those kinds of extra investments, or will it be sucking its teeth and even looking at countries that are investing in defense and wondering whether, you know, they're adding to their excessive deficits and so on?
Thanks a lot, Ian, and thanks a lot for you for inviting me to that topic. Maybe to address the first question you just asked, I think the key question Luigi and Sophia asked with their paper in a very elaborate way is, how can we actually get the Europeans to stop talking and do a little bit more? And that's a question we have been asking for 20 or 30 years. Which is a bit depressive, I would say. But if we would find an answer, so how do you actually make states move? How do you change strategic cultures? How do you actually change an assessment in a way that it really would make a difference for European defense? I think that's a little bit the $1 million question. And as to Germany, we have elections in September 2021. So we are entering the election campaign, which is hardly a campaign for rational arguments. But I'm very curious to see to what extent defense will play a role, and hopefully in a rather constructive than non-constructive way. But I would like to come back a little bit more on this really, really excellent paper. I have to admit, when Sophia and Luigi asked me to comment, I was like, I've been following this debate for such a long time. I know it by heart. And I read the paper and I was really, really amazed because you succeeded in bringing in new aspects which haven't been debated. And that makes it really an excellent and a terrific paper. You go beyond this typical Euro focus, you bring the transatlantic in. The industrial dimension is something that is hardly addressed, which is a really added value. And I found it in this kind of rather forward-looking and with very practical suggestions, a really, really useful paper in this moment of time, particularly now that we have a kind of transatlantic honeymoon hopefully coming up. So I think it's an excellent contribution. Having said that, I think I would slightly disagree on some points. When I read the paper, I had the impression you were rather positive about the EU defense initiatives. Having listened to you, I think you are not. So I think this first disagreement probably is gone. I think we are all three very skeptical about what the EU defense initiatives, PESCO, CARD and EDF have delivered so far. When it comes to the definition, I tend to defend a much larger definition of strategic autonomy or European sovereignty that goes far beyond the defense arm. I know we focus here on defense, and I will do that too, but I think to have a proper definition, we have to look far beyond the defense realm. And I think that we should focus far more on the reference object of autonomy or sovereignty or capacity to act. When we talk about European sovereignty or European strategic autonomy, who is that Europe? You hinted upon that in your presentation now. I found it less clear in your paper. Do we talk about the EU? Do we talk about NATO? Do we talk about Europe? Do we talk about the E3? Do we talk about changing coalitions? And I think if you want to have a clear understanding of who has to do what, it's really important to have a little bit, or to try at least to seek some clarity about the reference object. I sought to bring in some practical suggestions, but you were wonderful in the last minutes of your presentation and leaving a very long to-do list on practical capabilities and capacities what Europe needs to do. That gives me the time actually to concentrate a bit more on the lofty conceptual questions in the next moments I have, because you did all those practical hands-on stuff. So what I would like to do is actually to make 3 points. The first is, why are we still talking about it? Why do we still bother about that concept? The second is, how do we call it? Do we call it autonomy? Do we call it sovereignty? Do we call it capacity to act? And the last one is actually, how do we make practical sense of it? So how do we move beyond the rhetorical step and go into implementation? And what I would like to do is to suggest 4 clear-cut criteria on how we can actually grasp European sovereignty or autonomy. The first point is, why are we still talking about it? You have both underlined in your paper, this is not new. It goes back to the 90s or even further back. And I found, again, the definition of the European security and defense policy that came up after the Balkan Wars, where Europe was so utterly unable to do anything on its own. And when the European security and defense policy was created after the Franco-British Saint-Malo summit of '98, the idea was that Europe should have, and I quote, the capacity for autonomous action backed up by credible military forces, the means to decide to use them, and a readiness to do so. Here we have the definition. Everything is in there in 1999. It then came back in the European debates, but it was hardly ever supported by implementation. It was a little bit as if Europeans didn't really care about it. Love to talk about it, but not really to implement it. So why was it done back? It was back, or we have it back because of the 2016 global strategy, yes. But I think we mainly have it back because the security environment changed. You hinted at, or you named 2 points. The first is defense is back. I would say defense and power politics are back. With Crimea, with Ukraine, with Syria, with the instability at the southern border of Europe. So since 2014, we have a clear comeback of power politics in the European neighborhood, particularly with one country like Russia, where we thought we had a constructive strategic partnership. It's gone. We even have the nuclear dimension back. This is challenging for the Europeans because most, maybe at the exception of France and the UK, had prioritized soft power. Defense was kind of old dinosaur stuff we didn't really care about anymore. So defense is back. The second point you also made is that the US priority shift, even with Biden. China will remain a main focus, and Europe is more or less a strategic problem that is solved. You explained that perfectly, so I don't have to go back to that. But there's another one, a bit kind of more global aspect, is that the liberal order that particularly Europeans benefit, that Europeans value and benefit from so greatly, is questioned, and it's not yet sure what is going to follow. We have key international actors like Russia and China who redefine and challenge that order. West did it under Trump. And they even try to influence the inner functioning and the inner decision-making of Europe. I remember the Greece veto on EU condemnation of China's human rights records. So you can actually even come in from the inside. And for the Europeans, it's increasingly difficult actually to play an effective role in shaping a world order if other major powers just pick and choose what they like. So that was also a kind of wake-up call for Europeans if the kind of international rules are thrown overboard altogether. And the first, you mentioned that a little bit, is that Europe is challenged from within. Don't talk about Brexit, but about other European countries who question cohesion and cooperation. The first reaction to the pandemic was an inward-looking European reaction, even closing borders. Europe broke up, and we had the recovery fund adopted in the summer of 2020, which was this kind of wake-up call for Europe. Okay, we know what the right direction would be. But still, I think the first reaction of the pandemic was very telling. So the recovery fund shows that Europe is still able to do bold decisions, particularly if France and Germany agree and align. But we also know that those two countries are not enough to make Europe move. And in both countries, we have elections ahead, in Germany in 2021 and in France in 2022. Germany will see a government change, that's for sure. Angela Merkel is not going to run again. So we will have a new government, maybe a conservative green one. I do hope sincerely that France will not have a new president in 2022. So just to say that this is very unstable too. So I think those four developments make it even more urgent that Europeans have to somehow play a greater role in order to shape their environment if they want to make their voice heard. So you have an increasing pressure whether Europe wants to find or how it wants to find a place in a different emerging international order. Having said that, the question is, how do we make sense of that wonderful buzzword of European strategic autonomy or European sovereignty? Or as I would say, capacity to act. If you would break it down to a very basic definition, we would say it's a capacity or the ability of European states to set their own priorities, make their own decision in foreign policy matters, and have the means to implement these decisions alone or with partners if they choose them according to their own criteria. You will say that's a bit obvious, Claudia. Try a bit harder. So I will try a bit harder. It's not about independence. It's not about rejecting alliances. Europeans will always be better with partners, particularly with the US, and I underline that explicitly. It's not about freedom from the US, but it's freedom to do something. That's what I understand as capacity to act. So we must, as Europeans, we must be able to formulate our own objectives in a better way and be able to implement them. You could make it a bit more fancy and say we Europeans should have the ambition to be able to protect what we have built in the European Union or in Europe as a continent. And that's an ambition that actually should be normal. You could put it in different questions. Does Europe want to be an object in the rivalry between China and the US, or do we want to play a role on our own? Does Europe want to subordinate to the rules set by others, or trying to shape its environment according to its own priorities and values? So if you put it in one sentence, it's about being a rule maker or rule taker. Autonomy from that point of view is not an end state, but it's a gradual process. You are getting better at it if you try hard over time, and you can reach a higher degree of autonomy or sovereignty. But if that's the understanding, then it applies to all policy fields, not only defense. It applies to foreign policy, to energy, to technological standards, everything. And defense is probably the area where it's the most difficult to find or the most difficult to achieve, because the dependence is here probably the biggest from the US. This is my definition. As you rightly say, there's no agreement in Europe of what a meaningful decision would be. You could argue in favor, and you could say, if Europeans take a greater share for their own defense, they would increase their capacity to act, and they would be a far more valuable partner for the Americans. So we have a double win, a win-win situation. Europeans are more capable to act, and the Americans would value European commitment even more. Yet this is what I would call a reactive stance. We react to Trump, we react as Europeans to US expectations. But again, I see two motivations. I see the reaction. We have to do more because we don't know how this transatlantic relationship is going to develop. But I think, and I'm really convinced that we should have, as Europeans, an intrinsic motivation to have the ambition to be able to act to define rules and to defend what has been politically and economically achieved in Europe. So I see these two strands of motivations, the reactive one and the intrinsic one. Probably you could place both of them under the label of responsibility. So responsibility to be prepared to actually shoulder a larger share of military tasks. When would that happen? You hinted at that already. In cases where the US chooses not to intervene because it's not in their interest. In situations where the US might choose not to intervene because their forces are needed elsewhere. Or you hinted at that already. The question is, who is the exception? Is Trump the exception and things go well again? Or is Biden the exception? And after 4 years of Biden, we return to a new Trumpism. If that would be the case, Europeans would be well placed to think about how, in a long-term perspective, being able to be capable of act or capable to act in the defense realm. You addressed the criticism. The main criticism is that Europeans have been talking about defense for many years without being able to implement it. Why would that change now? We had a debate of European strategic autonomy since 2016. The EU defense initiatives haven't really delivered, to be brutally honest. 2014 Crimea was a much bigger booster for defense commitment of the European states than PESCO, CART and EDF together. So there is the danger of having yet another paper tiger under the EU label of European strategic autonomy, which I see very much, and I'm very much concerned about it. So let's try to make it actually, and that's my last point, how could we actually how could we define a definition with clear categories and criteria that help us guide implementation? So how does it mean in practice, or what I now say, being a rule maker, not a rule taker, pardon, being able to define its own rules? I think if you would like to implement European sovereignty, autonomy, or capacity to act, we should focus on 4 dimensions: the political, the institutional, the capabilities, and the industrial dimension of autonomy. The first is for Europeans to have political autonomy, capacity, or sovereignty in security and defense. We must have the capacity to define and agree our priorities and establish a vision for our activities in that field. And we have at least 3 key aspects to that. The first is, who is Europe? In defense, we can choose between the EU, European members of NATO, or smaller informal groups like the E3. The EU might have the biggest potential in political terms, but it will not be sufficient in defense, as it doesn't include important states like the UK, or I would even say Norway. NATO is not really capable to act in the moment, so probably it would boil down to smaller informal formats like the E3 who have become more important. Second point would be, who is actually able to provide leadership in such a format? What country would be able to drive a process? And the third is what Europeans want to achieve with European strategic autonomy. Is it just crisis management, or is it actually more on goes into territorial defense, what Europeans are not able to do in the moment? The second would be institutional autonomy, governance. So you need to have the structures to implement and manage the priorities you have agreed with your political autonomy. Again, crisis management structures are very small in the EU. You have a proven, running, standing, biggest alliance is NATO, with processes like the NATO defense planning process. So again, you have to choose between the institutions you have. The third element of autonomy or sovereignty are capabilities. It's about having the necessary capabilities to implement the political goals you have defined first. And the question is, what do you have Europeans ready? If you look what the Europeans want to achieve in crisis management in the European Union, in the moment they're not able to do it. If you look at NATO and the NATO defense planning process, in many areas, the US is providing the bulk of capabilities. So in the moment, we don't have in Europe the capacities to do what we decided upon in the EU and in NATO. I'm a bit blunt here because I'm running out of time. The last element after the political autonomy, the institutional and the capacity is the industrial dimension. And I'm really grateful that you brought that point up in your paper because it's often overseen. What does it mean, defense industrial autonomy or sovereignty? It means the ability of European states to maintain expertise in strategic technologies, innovative and next generation technologies, and to secure a supply of defense material. The defense industrial landscape in Europe is highly fragmented, and defense industry is not an industry like chocolate. It's mostly about sovereignty, why states are very wary to cooperate and actually consolidate. The other problem with defense industry is that it takes a lot of time to develop new stuff. If I give you just one example and you look at the Future Combat Air System that France and Germany decided to launch in 2017, if this project is going to succeed, it will be ready in 2045 or even later. So we have the issue of timelines and we have the issue of money in many areas. So to conclude, I don't see any alternative to strategic autonomy or European sovereignty. I would try not to use the word because I think it's actually a toxic word like European army. And I think we should really concentrate far more on the very practical suggestions you made in your paper and now in the presentation of what Europeans can do to improve their capacity to act. But again, the key question is what makes state change behavior? What really motivates country? And how do we get the political will to do that?
Great, thank you very much, Claudia. It seems to me that we should probably take your speaking notes and turn them into another paper, but no, that was great. Thank you very much. So the floor will be open for questions. Just a reminder, you can either ask those by raising your electronic hand, in which case you'll be unmuted, and you can ask your question in person, or if for some reason you can't do that, if you're in a noisy location or something like that, then if you type it in the chat, I will do my best to spot it and read it out. And a reminder for anybody who joined us late or didn't know, this is being recorded, it is on the record. So if you were going to say anything scandalous, you probably shouldn't do it today. Right, with that, the first questioner that I have on my list is Daniel Kahan. So if somebody could unmute Daniel, that would be great.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me okay.
Yep,
yes.
Can hear you loud and clear, Daniel.
No, thanks very much. Thanks to Sophia and Luigi, first of all, for a great paper. But my comments, it's only a couple of comments, but it's building on what Claudia, the direction Claudia went, just maybe in a slightly different package. Because I think politically, if you look at the EU political landscape at the moment, the concept of European sovereignty or strategic autonomy actually has more relevance beyond the defense world today for most Europeans. If we think about the COVID context, supply chains, even the euro, etc., etc., etc. I mean, it goes way, way, way beyond defense. So in some ways, I think we should be fitting defense into the bigger picture than starting with defense, even though I know the concept originally was meant mainly for CSDP. That's the first thing. And of course, as Claudia said, we have so many internal challenges of our own. The problem, I think, if you're looking at the EU from the outside, strategic autonomy stroke European sovereignty begins to look an awful lot like a fortress Europe, frankly. And you see this on the migration debate, you see it to some degree on the economic debate. And so that it's just something to bear in mind, that Europeans maybe aren't seen as internationalists as they like to think of themselves to be around the rest of the world. But specifically, this is a very tricky moment for this discussion, precisely because of President Biden's election and inauguration yesterday. Because on the one hand, frankly, I don't think there's a political incentive for people to really invest in military autonomy from the United States at the moment with Joe Biden in office, because of course he's a very firm Atlanticist and has been going back decades, back to when he was on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and indeed chair of it, let alone later. So, you know, there's a giant sense of relief for a reason. So it's easier to think autonomously on economics. It's much less easy to think autonomously now militarily or on security issues. At the same time, though, to contradict that point, or complement that point maybe is more accurate, Joe Biden will certainly want Europeans to take more responsibility. So the concept of strategic responsibility, which I think Claudia was touching on too, I think is a good idea, a better phrase, frankly, than strategic autonomy, because you can't really be strategically autonomous if you don't defend yourself. You know, we have to accept this reality, and no one wants to get rid of NATO. So we have to work within that framework, not try and appear as if we're trying to leave that framework, and especially not now with Joe Biden in the White House. But Joe Biden will want Europeans to do more. And I'd go a little bit further than Claudia and ask a simple question. You know, on industrial questions, frankly, these issues won't be resolved until long after Joe Biden is no longer president. It does take such a long time to shift industrial practices and capability focus. But what if there is a future Libya scenario? You know, the Obama administration hesitated in 2011, that's 10 years ago, believe it or not. I feel old now, but they hesitated on that operation, eventually got involved. You know, if this were to happen again, is it inconceivable that Joe Biden might simply say, well, that's your problem, you have to deal with this, and then what would we do? So there's a few contradictory comments there, but I think it's an extremely tricky time on these subjects for Europeans. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I don't know whether any of you wants to respond instantly to Daniel's point. I like the idea of strategic responsibility. I think that is a good concept, and we should probably try and work with that a bit more. But Sophia, why don't you go ahead?
Those weren't really questions, so this isn't really a response, it's more a conversation. And thank you so much for those comments, Daniel, and also Claudia, for engaging with the paper so deeply and also outlining the more sort of philosophical contextual context for all of this. There are 2 points which were made, which I wanted to pick up on. One is this question of who is Europe in this? And in our paper, we focused on the EU. You know, we had a very clear essay question, which is what can the EU contribute to strategic autonomy, to European defense? And I think we've ended up with a sort of both a reckoning and some hopeful, faced with a lack of alternatives, optimistic suggestions for how to go on. The main points for me where the EU can perhaps add value in the defense field are 1, through financial incentives to the budget, and 2, through intelligence coordination and intelligence input into threat assessments, which is something that the Strategic Compass is trying to do. But I think really where a lot of the European defense work, the European army work, if you will, is actually happening is in bilateral, trilateral cooperation, in the European Intervention Initiative, in the FNC and the JEF. And there really what we see is you develop a strategic culture by exercising together, by deploying together. And for me, this is one of the more realistic scenarios of European defense. It's coalitions of these countries deploying together, though of course, we can't, that doesn't mean that we can stop talking about the EU, because as a German, for example, this poses a problem for the Bundeswehr if cooperation happens in coalitions of the willing, if it happens outside the bounds of the EU or the NATO. So I still think it's a useful conversation. It's just, it's a different conversation. And then the other question is the what is strategic autonomy question, and both Claudia and Daniel picked that up. And I think for us in this paper, it was really important to focus on the defense and security dimension, but of course the concept has been applied beyond the realm of security policy to the economic field, where it's mostly called European sovereignty, where there's also some debate over its precise meaning, right? For some, it denotes the EU's power to shape global rules and to come to a level playing field. And then there are others who think that it refers to the power to create more globally competitive European companies, to reshore certain industries that are deemed of critical importance. And here I would argue that perhaps 2020 has shifted that debate a little, perhaps away from the US and towards China. And the pandemic, I think, has served as a reminder of the deep interdependencies and the strategic investments made by China in critical infrastructure, which have become a de facto danger and which has motivated many member states to broaden the scope of industries included in their investment screening provisions. And this is where we see the overlap between economic sovereignty discussions and defense autonomy discussions, if you will.
Yeah, Claudia, go ahead.
Three very brief points. I totally agree, Daniel, with defense being not the best case study. If you would look at the trade and economics area, Europe has about 20% of the global GDP. And that obviously gives us a far bigger power with all regulations and rules that can apply to shape the environment and to shape order. So I totally agree on that one. But maybe defense is so interesting because it's such a difficult area. And because it gave us such headaches over the last decades. The second point is to what extent the US approach to European defense will change. For those who are around a bit longer might remember the 3Ds of Madeleine Albright. No discrimination, no decouplement, and no a third D. No, Sophia?
Wasn't around, but I read about it. Duplication.
Okay. So to put it in a bit blunt terms, it was always, please Europeans do more, but we decide how you do it. And the question is, and if Europeans did something which Americans didn't like, it didn't really work out. So the question is whether this kind of inherent contradiction or inherent tension will change, whether there will be a greater, how shall I put it, a willingness to accept a European way of doing things. And that could be, that's I think is an interesting question ahead. The last point is on formats. I very much agree with what you said, Sophia, about the real music or the real success being in smaller and minilateral formats. But the big challenge we have then is how do we link in a meaningful way those islands of cooperation with the bigger institutions? That's something, it's certainly a question that we Germans love to ask because we are so much into EU and NATO, but it's also interesting for all the other countries inside the EU and outside. How can you make the most of what the EU can offer? The EU can offer industrial or has industrial tools, which NATO doesn't have. NATO has other elements which the EU or smaller formats don't have. So I think the key question is how can we actually make the most of the various formats we have, and how do we link the islands of cooperation in a way that they are actually interlocking and not interblocking? And that's a question we haven't been terribly good at in the past. So I think that's really one of the challenges we need to think about.
Great. Okay. I now have 8 questions in the in the hands up and 1 in the chat. So I'm going to take them. I think since we've got about half an hour, I'll take them in groups of 3, and we'll see how we get on. So the first one is from James Bergeron in the chat, who I believe is a political advisor to the NATO Allied Maritime Command. I hope that's correct. And he says, how do we deal with the parallel between the logic of strategic autonomy and the logic of Brexit? Both stress sovereignty, not cooperation, rule taking versus rule making, not shared rule making. But that was precisely the virtue of the EU that most Europeans think the British failed to understand or appreciate. So, you know, is strategic autonomy doing exactly what the British are doing, actually, you know, breaking something up that works better together? Perhaps, Luigi, do you want to have a crack at that one first? And then I'll do the next 2 questions as well, which is, the first one is from David Hannay, if somebody can unmute David. David, you can go ahead.
Am I unmuted?
You are.
Okay, thank you. First, a plea that it should be autonomy or responsibility, but not sovereignty. We've just been through several months of complete garbage on sovereignty in this country. And if you look at the origin of the word sovereignty in the European Union context, it's mainly Macron. but every time I read a piece of paper about French nuclear policy, I'm quite clear what he means by sovereignty, and it's not European. So I would rather see autonomy or responsibility. My question to the panel is this: don't you think that a lot of the, and I do think the papers that the CERs produced for this were very good, but don't you think they were all written, and don't you think much of our thinking was shaped by the period when we all feared that Trump might win, and by the 2 months of psychodrama we've just been through when we weren't sure he was going to be shifted out of the White House? Because it does seem to me that we aren't taking enough account of one simple, absolutely brutal fact, which is that we Europeans in the widest sense have a massive investment in the success of the Biden administration. We need it to succeed, because if it doesn't, we're all in the soup. Now, if that's true, then I think we do have to approach some of these issues that are being discussed this afternoon with a slightly new framework in our minds. And I entirely agree with Daniel. It's probably easier when you start on areas that aren't defense. But I do think that if I am correct, that the success of the Biden administration is a major interest for all of us Europeans, then we do really need to build that into our thinking. The final point I'd say is, I do really think, I know I bleated about this before to you, Ian, I do really think that writing papers on this which don't refer at all to the United Kingdom is a bit of a mistake.
Okay, thank you very much, David. The last one in this little group before I ask Luigi to answer first is Pauline Neville-Jones. If somebody can unmute Pauline, please.
Can you hear me?
Yep, absolutely.
Great. Well, thank you for the discussion, and thank you for letting two Brits intervene in the debate. I think that David Hanley just made a very powerful point about our interest in the success of the Biden administration and therefore continuation of the same sort of policy. I want to just make three brief points. The first is actually about American attitudes. I think we will see a certain amount of continuity. Obviously, the relationship will be less scratchy. I think that's pretty clear. I doubt that the Americans will reduce their pressure for more contribution from the Europeans, and they will want to see it, I think, in the NATO context. I think they will be traditional in that respect. And they will be interested in it having, I think, practical effect, which means does it increase NATO capability? And on capabilities, I would like to ask you, where do you assess the level of ambition? I mean, I think it was Claudia who said that we ought to be able to protect European assets. That should, in my view, mean capability to intervene in Ukraine. But is that the case? It seems to me that's a pretty tough one. Where is the limit in your view? To what extent is there still implicit reliance on US capability, which was much more important when the fighting was going on? So I think one has to have a certain degree of realism about what autonomy means, let alone anything else. Something I forgot to say about American attitudes, which affects capabilities and industrial capability. I have a strong suspicion that behind the word industrial there's France. I do think that an implicit bargain, as the Americans see it, is that the fact that they contribute the lion's share of NATO finance for its capabilities does mean that that Europeans buy some of their kit and buy some of their particularly some of their big platforms and some of their really big strategic weaponry in which we all share. I think they will look fairly carefully at what autonomy means in that area, and particularly if it starts to appear like autarky. My last point is the following. In the planning world that I grew up in, strategy was normally led by foreign policy, and defense followed, because it was the implementing arm, one of the implementing arms. In that context, could somebody say something about the significance in their view of the agreements just been signed by the EU with China, which I think, may be wrong, but I think the Americans will regard as complicating life when it comes to the alignment of the allies in one of the big politico-strategic questions of the coming century, current century. In other words, how far do you think you can go in pursuing policies which are identifiably different from those of the Americans, and the Americans likely to see as potentially contradictory, and still, in a sense, progress with a defense autonomy, which certainly as things stand at the moment, you would, I think that would be fair to say, is meant to align with NATO. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Pauline. Okay, Luigi, do you want to have first crack?
Yeah, I will, and thank you to all those that have commented, including Claudia for her feedback on the paper, very helpful. So just going to start on the EU and China. Well, it's quite clear to me that the EU is not willing to go completely alongside with the US on China, and that this will continue to be the case, potentially causing some frictions. It will lead to contradictions in the sense that Europeans remain dependent in defense on the US while they're trying to assert their autonomy in other areas of policy, whether that is pursuing a different policy towards China, or indeed taxing US digital giants, trying to regulate them more. It's not as if other areas of autonomy are, I think, less controversial than defense. Nord Stream 2 in that regard, I think we'll also continue to see the US pressing Europeans. And under Biden, that pressure will probably be rather soft, but in the future it could become much harder if there is another president in the same mold as Trump. Going to Trump and Lord Haney's point, I don't know, perhaps the paper was slightly colored by when we wrote it. I've become even more pessimistic since then, in a sense, with Trump inciting his supporters to attack the Capitol, his supporters not really seemingly wanting to believe in reality. And of course, we want Biden to succeed. But we also, as Europeans, I think, and that includes the UK, have to hedge for a scenario where what we've seen in the US over the past 4 years represents as much of real America as what we saw in the previous, for the duration of the post-war period. On the Brexit question, I would say that essentially EU autonomy aims to be able to shape the rules in a way that is substantial and effective and to the EU's advantage. Brexit privileges being able to shape the rules, but in ways that might not be to the long-term advantage of the UK. So that goes to say that you need critical mass, and that is, I think, the added value in European strategic autonomy. Now, if the US were a completely reliable actor, then that wouldn't be an issue. But because of what I've said before are my concerns, I don't necessarily think that that's the case. And of course, European strategic autonomy, in my view, should include as closely as possible those European actors that share European values, whether that be the UK or Norway, as Claudia mentioned. But of course, with the UK, I think it does imply a more constructive relationship than perhaps what we have seen develop so far, or with the UK, for example, denying diplomatic status to the EU representation. That's not really a very good first step. The last point I want to make is on something that was brought up even in the previous discussion, which is on foreign policy rather than the discussion on security and defense, because at the end of the day, this discussion that we've been having is about generating capabilities that so that Europeans can be capable of acting. Does this involve the US? Does it not? But ultimately, if we disagree on our assessment of the security challenges that are facing us, that doesn't bring us very far. And that's not only true of things challenges like those from China or Russia. Arguably, we do all share a much more common stance these days. But I'm referring to, for example, what happened in Libya last year in April of 2019. There was a peace process underway. A party to that peace process decides to launch an attack on Tripoli. Europeans, in theory, this is a very clear-cut case. There's a UN-recognized government in Tripoli. Europeans very divided about what to do because France has been quite ambiguous about its strategy and at times supported the party that was carrying out the attack on civilians in the city. So, I could also bring up the Eastern Mediterranean. And if I can emphasize this last one thing, it would be that what we need above all, aside from capabilities, is a much stronger culture of consultation. Now, this might mean lots of exchanges at lower levels than they have been taking place and at a much higher intensity. But if we do want Europe, and including if we want the UK to remain plugged into European foreign policy closely, then we need structures to be in place to ensure that, and we need the very regular dialogue and consultation that enables that.
Great, thank you, Luigi. Claudia, did you want to pick up the point about the level of ambition and whether in fact it does extend to the EU being able to intervene to defend European values in Ukraine? Because I mean, that's a question of particular interest to me as well, but I think it's a very good question. Just how high are our levels of ambition?
I think a good starting point is to look at the levels of ambition we already have. And we have a clearly defined level of ambition in the European Union, which dates back to 1994 on the Petersburg Task. And the Petersburg Task include things like peacemaking. It's not only peacekeeping and evacuation, it's actually peacemaking, which is a pretty strong ambition. There was a good study, I think 2 years ago or 1 year ago by IISS and the German Council on Foreign Relations, where they made a little planning game where they developed scenarios, and then they looked at what the Europeans would be able to do with the capabilities they have. And they had a little add-on, and would Britain make a difference or not? And the short answer is Europe would not be able to fulfill any of these scenarios, except I think it was evacuation. A bit sad. The other level of ambition we have is in NATO, the one that is enshrined in the political guidance from last year. So we do have levels of ambition, but at the same time, levels of ambition are more or less planning thresholds. What we are doing out of it remains a political decision, like Article 5 remains a political decision. So I think we obviously need to think about what we want to be able to do, but that's not only a technical question of capabilities. It's also, it's particularly a political question, and that obviously goes a little bit in the direction of the European strategic culture that Sophia mentioned. But I want to make a tiny point on the Europeans having an interest in succeeding, in Biden succeeding. I totally agree. And we have the interest because we want, as Europeans, we have an interest to show that Trump was the exception and Biden should be the rule. So we have a very strong interest in doing that. The question, however, is that we should not overestimate our role as Europeans. I think the question is far more decided in the US than with us. Still, we have a strong interest in doing that. But again, I think we should not overestimate our role here. What I find particularly difficult is that the transatlantic honeymoon we are entering now comes at a time where 2, or let's say 3 important European countries, the UK, Germany, and France, are very much concerned with domestic debates. In Germany, we have elections this year. In France, we have them next year. And Britain, you have your own debates, if I might say. And some of those elements that might help us in re-establishing transatlantic relations, for example, in Germany, stronger military commitment might be really difficult in the domestic debate. So what might that help us on the transatlantic level might be really difficult on a German debate. So how do we actually succeed in making the first, say, 6 months or 12 months of the transatlantic relationship successful to show Biden or the Biden administration, who friendly asked the Europeans, do you want to cooperate, to give them a friendly answer? Trump was bullying Europeans into do more. We didn't. If Biden now asks friendly, please do more, and we don't do anything, this will be highly counterproductive. Something which we Europeans really need to avoid is entering in a beauty contest for the Trump administration. Berlin is likely to be the go-to partner more than the UK and more than France, because many people expect Germany to be able to actually rally countries, to bring them together and to create a certain cohesion. This might not be really helpful, and it might raise tensions among Europeans, and I'm not sure whether it will really avoid that beauty contest, but that's something really we should do for. Last thing on European defense. I think if you put it very simply, we have 4 elements that will decide whether European defense will move forward or not. These are the public budgets. Sophia hinted at that. It still looks nice this year. It will look far less nice in the years to come once the economic consequences of the pandemic will hit European defense budgets, particularly in those countries who already suffered before. So first, public budget. Second is the security environment. So the threats Europe is facing. The third is the contribution of European states to the transatlantic relationship. And the last is to what extent we are able to coordinate among these various formats of defense cooperation we have mentioned before: EU, NATO, ISWI, and smaller formats. If we succeed on those 4 criteria, there's a little bit of hope for defense, but I don't say it's easy.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, I've got 4 questions left and we've got 15 minutes, so hopefully we can get through those. So the first pair of questions goes to Tim Lawrenson, and the next one after that, David Liddington. But Tim Lawrenson first, if you can unmute, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Tim.
Hi, good to talk to you. Thank you for the paper. As always, an interesting addition to the debate. And as Claudia said, I think my sense is it's an area that has become quite toxic in the discourse, and it's perhaps why I increasingly hear the term technological sovereignty in industrial circles as a sort of substitute term. But to be honest, I think it is just that. It's effectively the same thing, addressing industry. I think my sort of main point would be, I think the description of strategic autonomy in the paper is perfectly measured and sensible. And indeed, if that was what everyone understood it to be, I think we'd be in a happy place. But I don't really think they do. I don't think it's the common view. And I think it's particularly not the common view in relation to the defence industrial side of the policy. And Claudia asked, why has this issue come back now? Why is it controversial? Maybe I'm just too close to the industrial side, but I do wonder whether it's because the EU has now got involved in the defence industrial side of things and has had to try and work out what it means for the industrial side. And it's certainly true that strategic autonomy has been a key driver in some of the new EU instruments. So, certainly EDF, European Defence Fund, and perhaps to a slightly lesser extent PESCO, but it's certainly there. And I note that the report states, and I quote, the EU's defence fund does not exclude cooperation between EU-based defence companies and US firms on EU-funded projects. However, its eligibility rules stipulate that third country firms cannot have access to sensitive information, own intellectual property funded by the EU, or transfer it outside the Union. And I think, whilst, actually I probably quibble with some of those, I think they kind of miss the bigger point, the elephant in the room, which is the clause that says no third country can have any controls or apply any restrictions over the output of an EDF program. And the same rule actually applies in PESCO. And of course, we just had recently the third country rules of PESCO published. And frankly, that particular constraint makes any worthwhile cooperation almost impossible. So we've got this strange situation where, in theory, there is a kind of openness to work with partners in those EU instruments, but in practice, it's almost impossible. And there's just a disconnect there that I don't understand. And maybe there's a misunderstanding of how these things actually work in real defence programs. I accept that EDF and PESCO are just part of the defence cooperation picture, and indeed, EDF fund level has dropped from the original ambition, but it's still a big sum of money, and in fact, it's way more than was originally being dreamed of when those funds were being conceived. I think the goal that they set of 13 billion euros was pretty ambitious. So I think, in a sense, probably ended up at a level that is realistic. So I sort of wonder whether the pragmatism in the paper, when it talks about strategic autonomy, is kind of talking outside of things like those EU instruments and perhaps outside of EU frameworks altogether. And whether, when the German defense minister was arguing that, we just sort of give up on these dreams, it was more a reflection that there are those that have this absolutist view of what strategic autonomy needs to be, that seem to have kind of dominated the thinking, certainly on the industrial side, rather than, your more pragmatic version. If that was the version that everyone agreed on, perhaps, she'd never felt the need to say that. So I just wonder whether you have any thoughts on that.
Okay, thank you very much. And next I have David Lidington. So if somebody could David has just disappeared from my screen, but I don't know whether that's because his question has been answered. Can somebody unmute David? No? I can see that David's hand has gone back up, but I can't unmute him. Okay, perhaps we can come back to David. In that case, I will take Dennis McShane next, if somebody can unmute Dennis. Yep, you should be able to go ahead.
Great. Okay, thank you so much. Fascinating, very rich discussion. Couple of some slightly off tangent points. Firstly, the role of the 6 EU members that are neutral, plus Switzerland, some of them with big industrial capacity, most of them, Austria, Finland, Sweden, very, very well off, and they really could play some part in developing an Airbus model of defense production in Europe. I mean, Airbus just got hold of the British planes, the comments of French planes, the Caravels. I guess there wasn't a German plane at the time, and just produced a very simple standardized model of just 3 different types of plane and produced them solidly over the next 50 years almost. Why can't we do that with our tanks, our warplanes, our battleships? Just a real lobby to get that going. I'm glad David Hannay pointed out that we just can't ignore that Hamlet that is never mentioned in this debate, namely the absent prince of Great Britain. We've no idea how this is going to be worked through. The little petulant business today of saying the EU ambassador should have all his diplomatic status removed. God knows where that's come from. Ian, is it the Foreign Office? Is it number 10? I mean, it's just weird, frankly. But it's an indicator of this incredible desire in the heart of government, somebody to totally de-Europeanize anything that's to do that exists here in Britain. And the third point really is Germany. Sorry, it is Germany. What is the next chancellor going to do? I mean, Mrs. Merkel wasn't interested, was she, in anything that smacked of European defense? She was highly protectionist when it was a question of merging EADs and any German-British company. She's protected German tank manufacturers. Mr. Laschet from North Rhine-Westphalia, Duisburg, big center of Krupp, of the traditional German arms manufacturing regions. Is he prepared? Is he prepared to share anything? Or is this all going to be, the same discussion? I mean, I feel I was in this discussion 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 25 years ago. I'm now luckily well out of it, but all you young people up on the screen, are you going to be debating this in 30 years' time, and nothing actually has happened?
Okay, thank you very much. We may well all be still here in 30 years, but okay, Sophia, do you want to try and tackle that first? then I'll come to Claudia and Luigi.
Yes, I'll try to be brief. I'll pick up a couple of points though. One is the point that was made by Tim Lawrence, and I think was made in a different way by James Besch before that, which is that there is a brand of strategic autonomy that prioritizes autarky, and that I think is quite toxic. And you have seen what I think is a valiant effort by all three of us and in our paper to redefine strategic autonomy, not as the autonomy from something, but the autonomy to do something, which is how we would like it to be understood. But I very much take the point that while this is a constructive, hopefully, suggestion in a policy paper, it might not actually be where the European conversation is going, certainly in some capitals and certainly in the defense industrial space. I want to quickly talk about this question by David Haney, whether this is still relevant under Biden. And I do think that this election makes a huge difference. I was not one of those who said that whether it's Trump or Biden, it doesn't really matter. Transatlantic relations are going down the drain anyway. I do think a lot can be rebuilt in 4 years, and there's huge amounts of goodwill on both sides. But Luigi quoted this ECFR poll, which I think is so interesting and representative for a couple of polls that I've seen of the European public's incredibly low trust in the US political system, in the US as an ally in general, and a determination to stay neutral in the conflict between the US and China. And that is something that even President Biden will have difficulties tackling, I think, when it comes to repairing the transatlantic relationship. We hadn't responded to Polly Neville-Jones' point yet about, which I think is an excellent one, about how much is Europe as a client of the US defense industry a part of the transatlantic bargain. And I think it is, and we've tried to talk about that in the paper a little bit, and we pick up this thought and we argue that we can really only hope that the US takes a more generous long-term view of European defense industrial projects, like, for example, an Airbus model battle tank in the future, if Europeans can show that they're actually willing to, one, invest in them and to use them in a way that alleviates the burden on the United States for taking care of European security. And then the Laschet, what type of chancellor will Armin Laschet be? So Armin Laschet wasn't the candidate of the foreign policy establishment. That was Norbert Röttgen. He hasn't made foreign policy or defense policy a big part of his campaign so far, which is fair enough because so far the campaign was mostly about the future of the CDU really and the future of conservative politics in Germany. What do we know about him? We know that he's a committed European, committed to the EU, committed to rebuilding the Franco-German motor. We also know he's a member of the traditionally transatlantic party in Germany, the CDU. He's pretty mainstream in his views on the United States, on NATO, on needing to achieve 2%. We also know of his more idiosyncratic dovish views on Russia and China, which could become an issue in the transatlantic relationship. But I would argue that he has pitched himself as the continuity candidate, has pitched himself as a Merkelite. I think that the foreign policy status quo consensus is so strong that as CDU chancellor, even a different CDU chancellor won't really be able to make a mark, even if he had strongly different views from Angela Merkel. I think that there's a lot of contentment and perhaps even complacency in Germany with its status in the world, and it will be hard to shake that up.
Great, thank you. Claudia, do you want to say a word briefly? I've still got two questioners to come to, but I want to give you and Luigi a quick chance to answer the points that have been made.
A word on Merkel and a word on Laschet. Merkel is not a politician that expresses visions. You would never see an interview with Merkel like you would see with Macron, in 12,000 words outlining the world in all its details. That's just not her style. But I'm not really sure whether she has been so reluctant and silent on European defense. If you look at what happens in German defense over the last 6 years, there was indeed a change. I would say too little and too late, but there has still a lot of a change. I'll just give you some examples. The German defense budget raised since 2014. We were at 33 billion, we are at 46 or 7 now. That's quite a difference. Not at 2%, I know that. It's not always spent wisely, I know that too, but there is a very clear increase. And Germany is doing more operations in areas and under conditions it didn't do before. Think of the anti-IS coalition, think of Mali. Germany was one of the biggest, or still is, one of the biggest contributors to the deterrence and defense measures NATO has been putting in place since 2014, is leading one of the EFPs in the East, for example. So since 2014, you could actually observe a far stronger military commitment, but also a far stronger political commitment. Germany was one of the architects of the sanctions against Russia in the EU. It was very committed in the Minsk-Normandy formats. So yes, Merkel has been rather, according to a typical style, rather silent on those issues. But there has indeed been a change in the German defense policy since 2014, slower since 2017, but there is indeed development. And she was the one who made this famous beer tent quote that given the developments in the US, Germany and Europeans have to learn to stand a bit on their own feet. So there is, in fact, a certain direction by Merkel. Laschet, Sophia made the most important points. I would just add, it's not sure that Laschet is going to be the chancellor. He has been elected the head of the party. In the next step, the party, together with its Bavarian sister party, is going to agree on a candidate for the chancellor. It might be somebody else. It might be Söder, the prime minister of Bavaria, or somebody else. So it's not yet given that Laschet is going to be the chancellor. And it's not yet given that he's going to win the elections. So we have some kind of conditionality in those sentences. What he is going to do in foreign policy will, to a large extent, depend on who is going to be its coalition partner. As it looks now, but again, we don't know how this is going to end, these are very likely to be the Green Party. And then we would have, for the first time ever, a coalition of a Green Party and a Conservative Party, which is going to be very interesting. On the one hand, you would have this rather kind of continuity aspect that comes in with the Christian Democrat Party. And then you have the rather doing things in a totally different way that comes in from the Greens. And if they would find a more forward-looking foreign security and defense policy, that could actually be really interesting. So I'm actually looking forward to a green-black coalition because they would need to tackle some crucial security and defense issues, from nuclear question up to defense export, to defense spending, to cooperation formats, which we haven't addressed in Germany. And if the Greens would fight it through in debates, that could move the German strategic debate forward. Just as a reminder, it was Joschka Fischer, a Green foreign minister, who took Germany to the Kosovo War. And it actually helped advance the strategic debate. So I think we have interesting times ahead in Germany now, and particularly in September.
Great. Thank you very much. Luigi, do you want to say a quick word, and then I'll take the last two questions? Okay, or shall I come to you?
Not on those issues. I'm happy to.
Okay, I'll come to you first for the last round then. Okay, so technical problems prevented David Liddington putting his question orally, but he's put it in writing. So he said he agrees with Pauline Neville-Jones that policy agreement has to come first. What are the chances of EU agreement on more than lowest common denominator in the Western Balkans, given the debacle over the North Macedonia name question? And in Eastern Europe, given the recent embarrassing failure to agree an effective response on Belarus. So I think those are two very good questions about divisions within the EU. And then the last question of all goes to Charles Grant, if somebody can unmute Charles.
Can you hear me, Ian?
Yep, we can hear you now.
Okay, well, I had a really long and complicated question that would have taken at least 5 minutes to speak out, but I'll shorten it just in one very simple question. I think the lesson we got from what Claudia in particular said was that the lack of a common strategic culture is a huge problem for European strategic autonomy, and that one way around that problem is to have smaller formats like E2I, E3, or bilateral defence cooperation as a way of encouraging the strategic culture to change. But my question is there tension between France and Germany over that? Because it seems to me that the French are quite happy to contemplate alternative formats other than the EU, while Germans are much more reluctant to move away from the EU. So really, are you worried, Claudia, about Franco-German tensions over how best to enhance the common and more tougher strategic culture in Europe? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, Luigi, do you want to take a first?
Just a very brief word, and I use the concept of strategic culture a lot, and we also use it in the paper. I would kind of caution against using it as a broader way to signify an alignment in terms of foreign policy, though, in the sense that if it means, say, a similar attitude to the use of force and to strategic questions, then, you know, countries with a similar strategic culture can still disagree. Thinking back about, you know, France and Britain are considered to have similar strategic cultures, yet they completely disagreed on the Iraq War. But I'll leave Claudia to answer the actual question. On the Western Balkans, and EU foreign policy in general, perhaps just a very quick word, in the sense that as long as EU foreign policy remains veto-based, then I'm not really sure how much we can go beyond that lowest common denominator in cases where single member states are willing to block it. In some instances, if you don't need the EU's agreement to go ahead on a certain decisions, then it could be that this is where formats like the E3 or potential European Security Council that France has talked about could be helpful, because you generate consensus within that smaller format, and then you bring your weight to bear on the EU apparatus. But if that is not possible, then it could be because of enduring vetoes, then it's very difficult. Yeah.
Okay. Claudia.
The short answer is yes, there is a problem. And if I would elaborate a bit more, I would say it's an interesting one, because the E3 format as a defense minister format has been formalized by the German defense minister AKK, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, this August. In the same time, this is exactly the tension that France, particularly over the last 5 years, or Macron, changed its security and defense approach towards a recognition, or towards an approach that is more focusing on formats that actually deliver. So on a pragmatic use of formats that can be on that one dossier, the EU, on another one, NATO, on another one, the European Intervention Initiative, and on another one, bilateral cooperation with another country. So a very pragmatic, result-driven approach. And this is totally opposed to the German approach, which is really functioning in the institutional formats. Our DNA is institutions. This explains also the deep divide, or the deep debate that was between France and Germany on PESCO and the European Intervention Initiative. Germany was reluctant to join the European Intervention Initiative because it was explicitly put outside the institutions. So Germany is afraid that having those informal or smaller formats might actually undermine the institutions, to put it very bluntly, that helped Germany to come back into the family of respected states after Second World War. So you don't undermine and you don't mess with institutions. The problem is that in real life, Germany is very much using informal formats. I mean, after all, also Normandy is an informal format. E3 is an informal format. So how do you actually bring those, what you are doing, and this, what you actually say that you are doing, together? But what we can really expect is that this tension between France openly advocating informal, smaller formats, and Germany openly saying we don't like that, how you bring that together. And I think this is a tension we live with already, and we are going to live with in the future, and which Brexit made actually far more difficult to live in, particularly in the security and defense area. Because if you talk about the European Security Council, Luigi mentioned, it would only make sense if you have Britain inside, but if you have Britain inside, it's not in the EU. It's informal, so we don't like it.
Right. Okay. Sophia, the last word goes to you. briefly, I think, because we've run slightly over time, but I think this is such a fruitful discussion that I don't want to cut it short.
Comment on this very last point by Charles and Claudia, which is just to say that there are treaty-based provisions that allow the EU to task coalitions of member states with conducting an operation, which Germany hasn't seized upon because, one, we like institutions, but also two, we're not that interested in actually deploying. And my hope is that under possibly a green coalition, the Greens are committed to working within the EU, but they're also committed to reviving the Franco-German motor, and then possibly we will see some movement in this direction. But that's an optimistic hope. We can talk again about it in maybe 2 years.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank all of you who have stuck with us to the very end, which is a pretty good number, actually. It has been a fascinating discussion. I suspect that Dennis McShane is right in one sense, that it's a discussion that's going to go on for a very long time. I hope that we won't be debating precisely the same questions as we go on, but that we will actually be able to move forward. And I hope that in some ways, having a cooperative or a more cooperative administration in Washington will enable us to get away from some of the sort of sloganizing of the last few years and to look at some of those difficult practical questions that Tim Lawrenson in particular raised. I'd like to thank all of our panelists. It's been a really terrific discussion. I think there is material there for 1, 2 or more papers in the next year or two. So thank you all very much indeed. And look forward to seeing you at future CER webinars. Thank you.